Music is one of the most beautiful and universal languages that humanity has ever created. Its ability to express emotions that are sometimes too complex to put into words and touch something deep within our souls is a key part of why music has always been fundamental to what makes humans human. Each of us will have our own preferences based on what particularly speaks to us. But for fans of orchestral music, there is little argument that something remarkable in the transformation of music was underway during the period that coincided with the Napoleonic Wars. Tonight, we put music under the spotlight as scholar in music history Kit Kimbell joins us to unravel what was going on in the musical world during the period. We talk about how and why music was written, the way in which contemporary events influenced and shaped the developments in music and famous compositions, and Zack goes full fangirl over the genius of a certain Ludwig van Beethoven. This is Music in the Napoleonic Era, up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars podcast. You're listening to Josh Redden, and today I think it's fair to say we're going in a slightly different direction to usual. That's because we're talking about music, specifically the music of the Napoleonic period, which, as we're about to find out, was an important time for music, both in terms of musical history and in terms of its relation with politics. Alas, I don't want to steal the thunder of the man in the hot seat today. Joining me is Dr. Christopher Kimbell, who's a PhD graduate from Royal Holloway. He's recently written a book called Tradition, Community and Nationhood in Wagner's Die Meistersinger of Nuremberg, the pronunciation of which I probably just butchered. And in any case, he is an expert in music of the 18th and 19th centuries. Christopher, how are you?
Thank you. I'm good, thanks.
Can I just say, what a professional introduction.
That was stunning.
Normally, we get me doing these intros and they take about 4 years before we get anywhere near the first question. Josh, I mean, granted, I am now elongating the introduction, which is like really bad podcasting. But just kudos there. Nice work, Josh. But yeah, I've interrupted you in your flow. Carry on.
That's fine. I was about to introduce you, but Zack has introduced himself. So not
well,
that he needs
that
any
figures, right?
introduction.
That's consistent, if nothing else.
Exactly. So Zack White, ladies and gentlemen. Many of our listeners will know something about classical music without necessarily being experts or being able to kind of pin it down onto a timeline. So if you wouldn't mind, Christopher, could you set the scene for our listeners in terms of what was going on in the classical music of the Napoleonic period and what is about to change?
Sure. To kind of confuse people straight away, classical music gets used in two ways. So there's classical music writ large, which is all of Western art music from kind of 6th century onwards. And then we also divide that into a number of periods to help simplify stylistic changes from one era to the next. And this revolutionary Napoleonic period is at the cusp of the change between the classical period and the Romantic period. So I'll try and be specific whether I'm talking about classical period or Western art music in general. It's good that we're kind of starting with talking about musical details and terminology and technical things, because this was really the time when music starts to be treated as a text and notated scores start to get analysed and written about and thought about in more critical ways than they were in instrumental music beforehand. So very roughly to kind of talk through the changes, 1750 or so, we've come out of the Baroque period. And towards the late Baroque, which is when you've got people like J.S. Bach, who people might know the name of, music written for instruments is quite fussy and complicated and academic and detailed and rich and florid. And the classical period is a kind of distillation of ideals of the Enlightenment in musical terms. So it's all about a simple, clear melody, balanced phrases. We don't want to crowd the musical detail with loads of other things going on. You start to get some important genres of music emerging at this time as well. So the symphony is the big one, which is a piece usually in 4 movements, which are like shorter sections of a larger work written for orchestra. And the orchestra is starting to take form as well. So we get more of a standardized group of instruments that would play symphonies together rather than whatever the noble tended to have on hand or who the church could drum up that week to play things. So we get a standardization in types of pieces, how long they are, who's playing them, and the form that the movements take. So a symphony will usually open with a fast movement written in something called sonata form, which we'll come back to a few times. But simply put, it's just a way of structuring a piece through changes of key and returning musical ideas in a piece. That's usually followed by a slow movement, then something called a minuet and trio, which is a type of pair of dance movements, and then usually a quick finale as well. And all of this is possible because of something called equal temperament, which is the idea that when you go from like the note C to the next note C, they start dividing that into 12 equally sized gaps, which is, it's not perfect musically, but it allows you to go from one key to another without these clashing dissonances that would hurt your ears. And so the composers start being able to use changes of keys to tell stories and to create tension and resolution on much higher levels in a piece than you would have done earlier, where you just change key for coloring. So that's the kind of the end of the sort of classical period, which goes through until about 1820 or so. But at the same time as that's tailing off, Romanticism is beginning, which people might know as like a literary term rather than a musical one. So it's not ideal as a description, but it kind of matches up. And Romantic music is much more expressive. So some of the devices that people came up with in the classical period, like gradually getting louder in a piece, get taken a lot further still. And we get much more expressive uses of these devices. The orchestras get larger and larger, and more instruments get added to them. So you have more different sonorities you can bring in of different sounds of instruments. Pieces get much longer. So a Mozart symphony is usually about 20 or 25 minutes long. Beethoven's third symphony called Eroica is 50 minutes. So things rapidly get longer and people are trying to convey more through music. And that all comes with a change in the estimation of instrumental music. So it used to be the underdog to vocal music. And there's a whole change in the way music is viewed, where being able to communicate something you can't do in words is now valued more highly than just putting a text to music. So instrumental music becomes hugely more important. People convey more expressively. Dissonance, so notes that clash, are used more expressively as well, both on an individual kind of small local level of the music and across those key changes we talked about in forms. Things get more virtuosic, so composers are writing more challenging music for performers, and something called program music emerges as well, which is telling a more literal story through a piece of music. So there's a kind of synopsis of sort of beauty and brilliance and simplicity to extravagance and sublime and expression.
That is an amazing rundown. Thank you for that. A lot of my kind of GCSE and violin grade, whatever it was that I reached in the end, start coming flooding back. I'm immediately going to ruin this interview by going off piste and asking rabbit hole questions. Because as you were saying that, I was kind of, particularly when you were talking about how the rise in kind of the virtuoso element of music, and also the increased value of the instrument over the voice, made me start to wonder about the way in which people are educated about music during this period, and whether there's kind of a trickle down effect in the sense that singing kind of goes out of vogue in terms of what people are trained in. I'm particularly thinking here about what women are sort of educated, inverted commas, in, and singing is usually sort of put up there as this is one of the things that you need to be able to do if you're from a certain strata of society. Do we see a reduction in the emphasis in singing and a corresponding rise in instrument playing, or is this something that would happen over too long a period for us to be able to track? Because I'm conscious that people start talking about, lady so and so can play the pianoforte most well, sort of thing. But I don't know if that's more a Victorian-esque type development.
Um, but there's various sides of this. In the kind of economic sense, keyboards are still quite expensive instruments at this time. And when we're still under the patronage system of composers being under the employ of the church and nobility, those are the ones who have access to the best teachers. And so if you didn't have an in already, it's quite hard for you to get access to that learning. For kind of the everyday thing, the church is still where a lot of the music is happening, and that is largely vocal music. And I will probably get shot down by people who are not as focused on the Austro-Germanic tradition as me for saying this all. Because it's really a kind of a dualism of styles rather than instrumental taking over. It's just that it's been the underdog and it kind of reaches a high estimation. You still got all the opera things going on at the same time. So people like Rossini are kind of the parallel to Beethoven in an operatic sphere at this time. Song cycles do start to emerge as well. So Schubert, who's writing towards the tail end of this period, is very important for the development of the song cycle as a form. And obviously Beethoven sticks a choir into the end of his Ninth Symphony. So he's kind of bringing them together and saying, I've done everything you can with instrumental music. We need this as well now. So I might have kind of misrepresented the diminishing of vocal music. It's just that the instrumental music becomes more noticeably valued.
With all that crash course of kind of music that you've just given us in mind, where the hell is the link with the politics that we're more familiar with, or the history that we're more familiar with, that of kind of the political turmoil that we have going on at the same time as what seems to be like these musical transformations?
Sure. There's various ways of tackling this. We've just talked about economic and social factors, which I'll come back to a little later. But obviously something as cataclysmic as the Napoleonic Wars is going to change things about who has money and where it's condensed and who can afford music and so on. So I'll put that just in the background for now. In a musical sense, there's a style that starts to emerge in France around this revolutionary period, which isn't very well known today, but it's composers who I imagine people won't have heard of, like Méhul and Kreutzer and Gossec and Cherubini, people might know. And the kind of the things that mark out this style are larger, more kind of imposing sounds. So the orchestra gets bigger, it's playing louder. A singing melodic melody above it, which gives this sense of kind of grandeur and seriousness to what's happening, and also a military character in the music. And military in musical terms as a topic is usually in a quick tempo, so it's played quite fast. It's usually something that could be marched to, although they're not written literally as marches often. It has a martial feel to it. It's got a driving rhythm, so something that propels everything forwards and keeps it going. And there's very decisive openings to the music. So there's a strong, bold statement of something musically. And this probably wouldn't be as significant in music history if it wasn't such a big influence on Beethoven, who, ever since kind of 1812, people have noticed, oh, some of his heroic style is actually just borrowing things that the French were doing around this time at the start of the Revolution as well. So we'll come back as well to his heroic style later, but there is a kind of a military character in music and bold statements of things that channel some of the spirit of the revolution in what's going on. There's also a sense of a political use of music as well. So there's several operas that don't gain much traction, but that get written or requested in kind of links to what's happening during the revolution. So Blasius writes one in 1793 called The First Martyr of the French Republic, just a month after Louis-Michel Le Pelletier de Saint-Fargeau gets killed for voting for the execution of Louis. And so he writes an opera about this. And the Committee of Public Safety the next year then requests an opera called Le Congrès du Roi, which was written in 2 days by 12 composers, as a kind of summation of what's happening at the time. And neither of these things are hugely popular, but there is the sense that what's going on socially is quite important, and there probably should be some artistic link to what's happening. The last kind of side of this, people will need to kind of go with me on for saying it, but if the revolution is this huge change in power structures in Europe, and are getting rid of absolutism and old fixed feudal structures and liberation and fraternity and all these things. On a purely musical level, there is also a movement towards freedom in musical forms and what's happening in pieces, which Beethoven's heroic style exemplifies. And that's something which goes a lot deeper in terms of theory and analysis and things, but there are kind of ideological similarities in the abandoning of the old, the creation of freedom in musical terms through what's happening with themes in pieces as well.
So you kind of just brought us on to the next point there, really, in terms of your introduction of the idea of heroism. Obviously, Napoleon comes after the French Revolution, and to an extent, the era of Napoleon is the era of like of heroism in inverted commas, or of kind of like of individuality, of the self-made man. In what ways do you think that that era impacted the kind of rise of individuality or of kind of, as you put it, like musical or romantic heroism in music?
Um, I think it's important first to say that the revolution, rather than being a seismic event from nowhere, this is a time of kind of acceleration, as Schlegel puts it, where things that are already in effect are kind of moving faster and faster. And so there's a sense already for the kind of Enlightenment thinkers that there needs to be an enlightened ruler, someone who kind of bring about the changes that are being discussed in society and are being longed for. And this is often at this time, maybe strangely for some people, a nobleman figure still. So it's not kind of doing away with the monarchy entirely, but rooting out some of the problems and getting rid of the poisonous princes who are corrupting things. And so we get a number of works written that are about these types of topics. So like Goethe writes his play on Egmont, and then Beethoven writes an overture for Egmont, which kind of romanticizes this idea of, you know, the ruler who helps free the Netherlands from Spanish imperial rule and so on. And Beethoven tries to channel some of the same ideas in Fidelio, which is the only opera he writes. And it's got a long history we'll get into of kind of the false starts and keeps changing and the premieres fail because of the French invading and so on. But that distills a similar idea of taking like a French revolutionary topic for its setting. So in terms of kind of, like, I'm going back to vocal music, but in terms of the topics that people are choosing, they're doing things that link to individuality and heroism. And then that is also being channeled through the music they write to accompany it. The concerto is probably the biggest form for this as well. So we said the symphony was a piece written just for orchestra in 4 movements. A concerto is a piece for a soloist or a number of soloists with an orchestra, and it's usually in 3 movements at this time. Not exclusively, but it was usually in 3 movements. And Beethoven's Emperor Concerto is the one to kind of flag up here, which the name is misleading. It was attributed later to make it sell more. But in terms of what it does musically, it's kind of a fitting title. It begins with the piano with this hugely virtuosic opening, which is very unusual because normally the orchestra would start and state the melody and then the soloist comes in later. You've also got people like Paganini and so on, and these kind of touring virtuosi who are, you know, doing things people thought were unthinkable on instruments as well. So yeah, I think kind of heroism distilled through an individual is the way of looking at it.
So shock horror, one of the big things that people are probably screaming about is, well, hang on a minute. Bonaparte, master of propaganda. Surely there's a propaganda machine wing, let's say. That's a warped analogy, but you know what I'm getting at. There must have been a facet of Napoleon's propaganda machine that dealt with music. You know, we've talked to Claire Civita in the past about Napoleon and plays and like the way he would deliberately pitch up at the moment when somebody's about to deliver a killer line, not just to piss people off, but because he wanted to make these grand entrances and like disrupt the mood. So I'm partly curious whether or not we've got any kind of evidence of Bonaparte doing that with performances, but also you've talked about things like the revolutionary government and the Committee of Public Safety commissioning operas. There must be works that are commissioned by the French government to go, look, Napoleon's done X. Let's celebrate this with an opera or a concerto or whatever it might be.
Definitely, yeah. So he does recognize the political uses of it. He, hindsight, there are ways he could have done it much more effectively, mainly to do with nationalism, because he never really capitalizes on that. And there's problems musically with that as well. I mean, the first thing is, like we said with the Committee of Public Safety in opera, Napoleon takes over the Paris Opera and renames it to the Académie Impériale. And he gets to kind of vet what works are put on. And so ones that celebrate a ruler figure, either religious or military or diplomatic, become more popular at this time, surprise, surprise. And usually a mythic setting as well to kind of make him bigger than the man he is already, and so on. And a composer here who, again, people might not have heard so much of is someone called Spontini, who Josephine was a patron to. And Spontini writes a work in 1807 called La Vestale. And it's in this heroic style with big spectacle. There's processions, there's marches, hymns, ballets. So it preempts grand opera, which will become really significant in France from kind of 1830 onwards. And it combines myth with symbols of empire in kind of ancient Rome. So it's all things that Napoleon would have been fond of. And we know that there's some connection with them over this. It's not that he proposes it, but the musicians don't want to play it because harmonically it's too daring, it's too big, it's too ambitious. And so Spontini takes it first to Josephine and he says, no, yes, you should do it, and pushes it back. And then that's not enough. So he then goes to Napoleon, and Napoleon says, no, really, put this on. And so this happens, and there are some good recordings of this piece out there. It's not kind of lost entirely. But Napoleon then takes a bit more of a firm grip with this and requests a work to drum up support for his Spanish war. And this doesn't go so well. So this is a piece called Fernand Cortez, which he requests from Spontini. And so it's a kind of romanticization of Cortez's colonialization, really, of Mexico. But it begins with a mutiny, and it really emphasizes the Mexican resistance. And so it doesn't quite have the effect intended. And it goes at the same time that the Peninsular War isn't going too well for Napoleon. So that one gets kind of brushed under the carpet as well. So when he goes to Italy as well, it's worth mentioning, there's this sense of kind of bringing things back to France. And unusually music is included in that. So Kreutzer, who I mentioned earlier, who was the kind of violin virtuoso of the time, to whom Beethoven later kind of attributes a sonata. Kreutzer goes with them to kind of gather bits of music that are interesting and take them back to Paris. And there's all the usual kind of Egypt obsession as well. So someone makes a pastiche of bits of the Magic Flute that Mozart wrote, called The Mysteries of Isis. And it's just ripping off Mozart, but with a kind of weirdly Egyptian thread through it as well. So yes, there are these connections. The reason it doesn't work so well is that Napoleon's favorite music is Italian and not French. And so his favorite composer is Paisiello, who's an Italian opera composer, and Méhul, who's one of the main French symphonists at this time. He tells him, your music isn't Italian enough, essentially. So you kind of looking back, you think where this goes in the 19th century with nationalist music, he does kind of miss a trick here. But that is, replicated on a grander scale with all the countries he either colonizes, get a nationalist movement in rejection of him, or ones where he sort of is the enemy of my enemy, like Poland, they sort of get a nationalist movement out of it, and Russia and Britain in opposition to France and so on. So yeah, nationalism is this kind of gap that Napoleon doesn't do musically so well.
Like an absolute pro, you've gone and preempted what were going to be my two follow-up questions of what was that problem with nationalism, and also, what was Napoleon's taste in music. There is part of me that sort of hopes he likes something very sort of discordant and I don't know, almost what's the one that I can't think of the period we did it at school. Is it minimalist? Where you've got like the inversion and then you've got the retrograde and then you've got the retrograde inversion. Is any of this making any sense?
Those are terms linked to serialism, which is a kind of very modernist, early 20th century atonal dissonant sort of thing.
That's what I kind of want to be playing through Bonaparte's head, which says far too much. But to be honest, he was probably like all of a fan of like big kind of gutsy. He'd have probably loved Ode to Joy, right? Because
I mean, yeah, he likes lightness and frivolity in music. Um, he's not he doesn't like the German kind of heavy, dense, imposing sort of style of writing at this time. So Paisiello, who we said was his favorite, he commissions Paisiello to write a mass for his coronation. It has lots of musicians. There's like 500 between the choirs and the orchestras in Notre Dame. Um, but that's another piece to kind of listen to, I guess, as a kind of sense of where he's coming from is Paisiello's music and this mass in particular.
that's
Um,
the Te Deum, is it?
yeah, the Te Deum as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I've got some listening to do at the end of this.
He not only liked Italian opera, he also liked Italian opera singers as well. Am I right in thinking that?
Yes, there are several who he might have got a bit too involved with. One of them who
Mm.
starred in La Vestale after his affair with her, which I'm not sure Josephine knows about.
Oh wow.
Yeah, there's sordid stuff to kind of unpick there, but
Hmm. So I guess underlying this whole discussion about kind of whether Napoleon could have used music more effectively and kind of taken advantage of nationalism or kind of propagated it more through music is this idea that all of a sudden music is now more kind of popular, or there is a kind of there's a base for music where people outside of kind of elite circles are listening to it increasingly, which is perhaps in the contrast to what you said earlier about the patronage system and like elites and the courts sponsoring the production of classical music, classical period music. Can you walk us through like that transformation in terms of how music is suddenly, or is music suddenly appealing to more people?
yeah, I mean it's not so sudden. It's again over the space of 100 years or so that these things start to ramp up. But so the old system is patronage, where church and nobility fund music, and reading music is something that is really kind of it's like a controlled thing of the people would learn it in the context of the church or through teachers. Um, and the kind of the top position that you would have aimed for as a musician at this time was Kapellmeister, which is the kind of the court musical director for someone. So all the famous composers of this time, like Haydn, he is a Kapellmeister to Esterhazy. And in that role, you were controlled in what you wrote, essentially, because you were doing what the person who was paying your wage wanted to listen to. And it affects your freedom of where you can go and where your music can be heard and which commissions you can pick up for pieces. And so it's in some ways it facilitates music because you've got a lot of this money sloshing around where people want to give it to musicians, but it's also constraining music because it's fixing them to what that noble's whim was at that time. So like there's this weird sort of like a bass viol, so like an early version of a cello that Haydn's prince played, and he wrote 200 trios for this instrument because that's what the prince wanted to play every day, and he would have never written that repertoire without it. And so it's this, yeah, it's controlling and this facilitating factor musically. They did get some chances to have music heard elsewhere. So like while Haydn was still employed as Kapellmeister, he did write some Paris symphonies, which were a commission. This was 1785. At 26, he writes these. And the trend at this time is even before the revolutionary Napoleonic period, one of nobles economizing and slimming down a bit of their musical kind of clout. So when Haydn's old patron passes away and his son takes over, a lot of the orchestra is disbanded, and he's given this kind of freedom to roam, and he's kept on in just like a subsistence kind of. Here's some money, but you can go and do other things. So that's what allows him to go to London twice, and he meets Beethoven on the way, stopping at Bonn while Beethoven was there. And his time in London, he gets much more popularity for his music and picks up more commissions and so on. So it's a whole load of factors through this time that are sort of easing up the um, the condensation of music in these little hubbubs of wealth and power.
So I guess the big question then becomes who listens to this stuff? And we have these sort of ideas of candlelit soirees and people in their finery sort of turning up to sort of hear whatever Haydn's produced or Beethoven or whatever. You can tell that like my knowledge is kind of surface level and very populist when it comes to classical music, right? Um, but is that necessarily the case? Is this kind of one of these things where it is kind of a not that we can talk entirely about sort of a middle class and an upper class, but is this a sort of predominantly wealthy or wealthier um, kind of pursuit in terms of going to these performances, or do you have kind of trickle down to a kind of a middle class and maybe even sort of a more affluent working class? Is there that, or is there this sort of very clear divide between something that's a bit more folksy for the lower echelons of society and something that's much more sort of idealized and enlightened, I suppose is the term that they would use for the upper classes?
That's a really good point you mentioned about folksy stuff, because I just want to kind of again emphasize that this is classical art, serious written music we're talking about here. So at church, people would have heard stuff like this. And there is obviously the whole folk and traditional music stuff and popular music of troubadours and so on from ages ago, that's still rumbling along at the same time. Where you start to get this engagement from a bourgeoisie at this time is earlier in the 18th century. So 1725, you get a public concert series in Paris called the Concert Spirituel. And that's one of the first of these public concert series that starts. And originally it's planned just for when the opera is closed as a kind. So again, it's emphasizing that instrumental music isn't as important as vocal. But the tickets are very expensive. So it is really only the upper bourgeoisie and the nobility and foreign visitors who are coming, who can really attend these things. And we get things in London as well. So like the Academy of Ancient Music started about the same time. And through the century, gradually things get cheaper and you start to get a wider audience attending, still in the knowledgeable, kind of enlightened, if we like, classes. And the 19th century is really the kind of tipping point here with this, where all of those factors have come together and there is now the availability of performers and composers and musicians working outside of the patronage system to let these things take off. So like the end of the 18th century, we get a journal for music called the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung, which is a really important journal for kind of German music study. And we start getting some student groups and kind of amateur groups that will dedicate themselves to either a particular composer or a particular period of music history. And so we start getting the rise of this more studious amateur groups. Some of it is just with increased travel and the rise of a kind of mercantile class. You will get these trade fairs in cities or towns where lots of people come demanding entertainment. And so more groups spring up to meet that demand. And in London, the big thing that takes off is subscription concerts. Again, this is the very start of the 19th century, these happen. So it's like a season ticket to a football ground or something. You pay for a run of concerts and then you can go and see any of them. And again, at the start, they're very expensive and they gradually get cheaper as the halls get bigger and audience numbers increase. And composers need more work, so concerts are more regular. So like the Philharmonic Society of London starts in 1813, and they're the group that commissioned Beethoven's Ninth Symphony later on. So they start to become really important in the direction of what is getting written and for whom it's written instead of the nobility.
So I think what you're saying then is like kind of it was a long process almost, and one that was driven by commercialization almost, that the composers realized that they could make some money off of this.
Yeah. Um, Commission is the big one. So that's where
Hmm.
someone pays you to write a specific piece. And that's very attractive, first because your money is up front, but also because you know it's going to get performed, usually. Which if you just send something to the publishers, you don't know that it's necessarily going to get noticed and played anywhere. So commissions are really important. Um, and there was a slight change in the way that patronage was running as well. So like earlier, it was with the expectation of doing a lot of work for the person. So, the court composers, the Kapellmeisters, they would be directing an orchestra and leading rehearsals and composing music for all of the events and giving evening kind of chamber music whenever it was requested and teaching people. So they are kept so busy that they can't really do much else. Whereas with Beethoven, notably, we start getting more of a kind of stipend where they're just given money to be them and go and do their thing. Um, Instead of being such a contractual kind of in return for this, you must write X, Y, Z. Um, like I said earlier about the kind of the slimming down of courts as well, people need these things to take on to keep their livelihoods there. Um, Mozart tries to do this earlier when he gets just annoyed with Archbishop Colloredo and Salzburg because he doesn't get to write enough operas, and it doesn't quite go his way, and he's kind of hand to mouth at times. And there's all the stories about him dying in poverty and so on. But it becomes more of a possibility as we go into the 19th century, and this concert series thing opens up, and touring becomes more possible as well.
I mean, his name keeps coming up in this interview. It almost feels superfluous to have a question dedicated to him, but I think it's worth turning to who the figure who there's going to be no argument really is the defining figure of music in this period, Ludwig van Beethoven. So Beethoven, some people might not have known his life even coincided with the Napoleonic Wars, but now we know he was German and he was in Germany at the time. So can you tell us about his life and his presumably tumultuous experience of the Napoleonic Wars, please?
Yeah. So he's born in Bonn, which is in the Electorate of Cologne, in 1770. So around the same time as many important people for the Napoleonic period. And he's into a musical family. So his grandfather had been Kapellmeister in Bonn beforehand, and his father is a court musician and a teacher. And originally he tries to set him up as this touring little virtuoso like Mozart. And by the age of 12, he's employed in the court as assistant organist. And he dedicates a few pieces to the elector at that time. And his successor is one of these enlightened ruler figures, Maximilian Franz, who takes over in 1784, and he appoints Beethoven as court organist. So he's sort of moving up the ranks in the court system. And he meets several important people in Bonn, like Count Waldstein, who will be a patron in some of his early years. And revolution happens. Fear is growing that war is going to spill out of France. And so in 1792, he goes to Vienna. And this is endorsed by France and funded by him, and introductions are made by Waldstein. And he's going essentially to study with Haydn and learn from him, because Mozart has just died the year before in 91. So it's the idea that kind of Vienna is where music was really happening in Europe at that time in the instrumental scene, and Haydn is who he's going to learn all this technique from. So he goes there, and when Haydn goes on his second trip to London in 94, they kind of expect that Beethoven is going to go back to Bonn, but then France occupies it. So he ends up staying in Vienna, and he will stay there for the rest of his life, basically. And obviously Vienna has its run-ins with Napoleon's armies. So towards the end of the 18th century, there's a fear with what's going on in Italy that Austria is going to get invaded. And so you get a few pieces that respond to that at that time. So like Haydn writes his Mass in Time of War, then which is known in Germany as the Paukenmesse, for the kettle drums or timpani. And you hear this kind of booming of fate in the last movement. And Beethoven writes a few kind of patriotic songs at this time as well. So he writes one called A Farewell Song to the Citizens of Vienna, and The War Song of the Austrians, which is less imaginatively titled. And just as peace starts to come and you think it's going to be smoother in 1800, he then realizes he's going deaf. And so the storminess of war and all of those fears are subsiding. And he writes this really important letter, which he never actually sends, we don't think, in 1802, called the Heiligenstadt Testament, which is where he sets out his struggles with his hearing and he talks about suicide. And it's written to his brothers, but he just kind of keeps it in his private papers. And this kind of sets up the internal strife that is going to be a factor in him, musically and kind of socially and personally. And he becomes this quite difficult figure to be around and very kind of against the world in some senses. And so then, as people might know, France does end up occupying Vienna at two different times. First in 1805, basically without any opposition. And I mentioned earlier Beethoven was trying to write an opera, and he keeps trying to write an opera. And the premiere happens just a few weeks after this occupation. So most of the Viennese have fled. It's in German, so the French soldiers who are there can't understand it. It has about 2 concerts and then gets canned. So Fidelio has been through a few struggles and isn't yet taking off. A lot of his money at this time is from kind of publishing, selling to publishers, commissions, that sort of stuff. He hasn't really hit the big time as a public figure. And so although war will come back to him, it's kind of fortuitous for his career that he ends up staying. So 1809, there's the bombardment of Vienna, which only lasts about a day or so, I think. But there's these images of Beethoven kind of with pillows over his ears trying to protect his hearing and so on. And Napoleon stations a guard of honor outside Haydn's house, which is a nice touch. And we get the Emperor Concerto at that time, which again, title is not linked to Napoleon as emperor, but it's the most militaristic of Beethoven's pieces, really. And this is towards the end of his heroic style. So he starts moving into a kind of late period. But the send-off for this is a number of kind of potboiler pieces he writes, the most famous of which is Wellington's Victory, which is written in 1813, and it's kind of commissioned sort of in response to Wellington's victory at the Battle of Vittoria. And with my kind of musicologist hat on, it's a terrible piece. Like it's bad. It's not serious. It's like a parody of his heroic style. It doesn't use sonata form, which we said was this really complex generative form where you can have these motifs which give rise to these huge tonal struggles and so on. It's just like, here's a bit of the English anthem and then some musket fire. But it is hugely popular. We can say what we think about the public's kind of taste at that time, but it is helped by things that are happening contextually in Vienna then. So there's Austria has just kind of re-got involved with the war, so there's a patriotic feeling of, oh, we should support this sort of stuff. There's a benefit concert that's put on for Bavarian and Austrian soldiers who were wounded, I think at the Battle of Hanau, and lots of the major musical figures in Vienna come to play in this concert as well. And so Beethoven kind of capitalizes on this, and he programs his Seventh Symphony premiere as well at the same time, and he becomes a huge celebrity through this. And there is, of course, the reaction of people thinking he's sold out. But this kind of continues through into the Congress of Vienna and that period when all of Europe's dignitaries are there and many visitors and so on. And there's months and months of constant entertainment being needed. So he kind of rises to that time as well and writes some more fairly rubbish stuff like something called The Glorious Moment, which is a cantata. So again, it's not as much of a serious form. And he kind of returns back to himself and starts writing a lot more introspective music, like his late quartets that no one really understands at the time. So yes, there's the good and the bad in his engagement with war.
Yeah, I'm pleased that you were the one who said, Wellington's Victory. What the hell is going on with that piece? Because it's a curious one. I have heard it performed live, and yeah, I was kind of I can sort of see the idea there, because for folks who don't know, there are basically two motifs, I guess would be the technical term, right? Because you've got the English, which is basically what we would recognize as For He's a Jolly Good Fellow. And then now hoping that I haven't misremembered that. And then you've got the French one, which is something along the lines of the Marseillaise, I want to
I think so.
say. And then you get a little flash of that and a little flash of that. And then the French fade away as they lose the Battle of Vittoria. Obviously, it has zero bearing whatsoever on what actually happened at Vittoria, but realistically, you wouldn't expect it to. But sort of Brian Tyler, it isn't. And yes, okay, folks, I'm being facetious, but in terms of sort of getting you pumped up about an event or even really particularly connecting in an emotional level, I was cold listening to that, and it surprised me. Um, is that quite typical of battle compositions? Is he kind of tweaking what we would recognize as sort of typical Beethoven to fit into some tropes that people expect when it comes to battle compositions, or is Beethoven basically having an off day?
Um, I mean, it's important first to say, like you say, with battle compositions, it is a form that has existed for quite a long time. Um, so the battaglia is this Italian form of like representing a conflict through music. And an early example is a piece by English composer William Byrd, in 1590 called The Battle. And then Heinrich Bieber, who's this virtuosic violinist in like the late 17th century, writes a battaglia for 10 instruments. And Monteverdi writes a few and so on. So it is an existing format. Um, it's it's a bit too literal for music. Like what instrumental music, the reason instrumental music is getting valued at this time is this idea of absolute music, where you can convey the sublime and things that can't be put into words. Whereas this is like, and then he shot me, and then I shot back, and there's not much you can do with it that is profound. And it's another piece we'll come to later, but like the 1812 overture, Tchaikovsky hated it. He said it was complete without artistic merit. It's that you can say that he's getting kind of whipped up in the moment and enthusiastic about things, perhaps, but it's like if you compare that to something like Eroica, and there are some musicologists who argue that really that is the Wellington's victory is the real lens we should view all of his music from this time through. Trying to kind of diminish the influence of the French Revolution on his thinking, but I don't buy that, and many others don't either.
So Beethoven like composed Wellington's victory in 1813 to commemorate the Battle of Vittoria, as you say. So we know that in 1813 he was um, he certainly had antipathetic feelings towards Napoleon. Was that always the case, or was there ever a point where Beethoven, kind of the darling boy of the Romantic movement at this time, um, was sort of more enchanted with Napoleon?
This is one of those things where there's a story, and it has kind of simplified everything else that happened in his life. So the big event with Napoleon and Beethoven is the Eroica, his Third Symphony. And at some point it is going to be attributed to and or titled Bonaparte, and then it isn't. And it's more complicated than just that one piece. So his personal politics is very much in his youth pro Enlightenment, kind of revolutionary sort of thinking. Not to the extent that the Jacobins do it. Like there aren't many in Germany who were that in support of that kind of violent thing at that time. And there is a sort of link between him and this thinking. So when he's in Bonn, there's a set of poems published by this intellectual called Eulogius Schneider, who is one of the few German intellectuals who are very much pro-French Revolution. And Beethoven has subscribed to this, which in that is it's almost like crowdfunding. Like you would put your money up front and then your name gets published in the front as having sponsored the publication of this book. So we know that he was involved in a crowd that included people who were sympathetic to the revolution. But again, like I'd said with the kind of Egmont and stuff, he's sort of more approving of a sort of a transformation of the existing power structures rather than a complete doing away with everything necessarily. The the Eroica question then, when he's in Vienna, there's a plan for him to move to Paris. He's getting fed up at the positions he isn't getting and that he thinks his talent is kind of deserving of. And so at around 1803, this sort of time, he keeps talking about, I'm going to move to Paris, I'm going to move to Paris. And we don't quite know the order of when all these things exactly take place. Like October, there's a letter from one of his students, Ferdinand Ries, to a publisher saying he's going to write a symphony called Bonaparte. And then he realizes that one of his other really important patrons, who's someone called Lobkowitz, is very much not a fan of the French and the Revolution and Bonaparte. And he had put up 400 ducats to go towards this as well. And he was going to lose that funding and Lobkowitz as a patron. And then he hears about Bonaparte kind of announcing himself as emperor. And so the simplified version is he doesn't like that Napoleon has betrayed the revolution and crosses out his name on the front. And the kind of fuller version is there's already a lot of ambiguity between whether he is pro-Napoleon or not and which parts of the revolution he likes or not. He was already approached to write a piece for kind of dedicated to Bonaparte in 1802 as some sonatas and said at that time, no, he has kind of trodden over the revolution by his concordat with the Pope and bringing back kind of Catholicism. So he already has this moment of not wanting to dedicate anything to Bonaparte. And then we get the symphony and then it doesn't happen. And it's still mixed up with him possibly moving to Paris and then staying in Vienna. So there isn't a simple answer, really. It's a kind of disillusionment gradually encroaches from his ideals. But yeah.
There's a part of me, and granted, I'm not steeped in knowledge of Beethoven other than being an absolute fanboy, or of the music itself, that makes me feel like the drama is very sort of Beethoven-esque. Do you know what I mean? That I just associate Beethoven with a lot of kind of drama and ag and sort of grumpy gestures and cantankerousness, and it feels very sort of fitting and Beethoven-y.
It's very turbulent, his
yeah.
relationship with anyone.
You put it much more eloquently than I can. This is why you're the guest and I'm the imbecile asking the questions. Another one that we have to talk about, and you did allude to this already, is Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, right? For most people, certainly of my generation, it was probably ruined by the Iceland adverts, which went and took it and just bastardized it. But it is, I have to disagree with Tchaikovsky. I think it's a spectacular piece of work. For me, the 1812 Overture is everything that Wellington's Victory by Beethoven isn't, if you see what I mean, in that it just sort of feels as though it lands and it sort of builds to this crescendo, and it's got cannons in it, which instantly just improves the quality of the music by about 15%. That is a precise mathematical measurement there, folks, that is actually definable and quantifiable. But the thing with the 1812 Overture, of course, is that it's composed much after the event. So this leads us, I guess, to talk more about not only Tchaikovsky's influences and the creation of the piece, but just sort of the lasting impact of commemoration through inverted commas classical music. And I promise that this isn't a question that Luke has put us up to, like the memory of music through, or the memory of the Napoleonic Wars through music. It's genuinely an obvious thing to pick up on, and I'm curious about what we can kind of discern about it.
Yeah. So the 1812 thing, first of all, it's written in 1880, and it's not Tchaikovsky's kind of decision to do it. He's commissioned to write one for the commemoration of a cathedral, which itself is a commemoration of Russia's victory. And it's also to celebrate the Tsar's Silver Jubilee. So it has all these nationalist undercurrents going through with it. And he's not the first person to write pieces like this that are kind of commemorating Russia's victory, because it's a huge moment in Russian history at this time. So you get later pieces in, like Prokofiev writes an opera on War and Peace in 1946, which the Soviet Committee of the Arts at that time said, no, it's not patriotic enough. You need more marches during the war section. So he goes back and dutifully adds a bit more bombast to it. And there's loads of it, like John Field, who's a really interesting figure. He's an Irish pianist who ends up traveling with his teacher and ends up in St. Petersburg and invents the nocturne. So Chopin is hugely indebted to him, and Mendelssohn and all these people. And he writes a march dedicated to 1812 and so on. So it is a moment in Russia. France has its time as well with this. Berlioz, who I might have mentioned earlier, is really the main figure in French Romanticism. And this is after Beethoven, really. So 1830, he writes his Symphonie Fantastique, which is the kind of huge programmatic works kicking off French Romantic instrumental music. But he goes through a bit of a Napoleon phase, and so he plans a grand symphony dedicated to Napoleon, and it doesn't end up happening, but his Te Deum was going to be a choral bit at the end of it, which itself is very Beethovenian, having a choir at the end of your big symphony. And he writes a piece called The 5th of May as well, which is set to a narrative of someone hearing of Napoleon's death on the 5th of May. Otherwise, it's not something that is a constant source of inspiration for composers. There isn't a lot of stuff going back to it and recognizing it. It's more a kind of the changes that happened during that time that were or weren't related to the war, and the nationalism that came through it kind of ties them all back to this moment, rather than there being a lot of these war pieces, because like we said, it's not a hugely inspiring kind of musical topic, at least, to write.
I mean, do you not think that's slightly surprising though? Because like the French Revolution, for instance, has proved so artistically inspiring in kind of other forms. Why do you think it hasn't kind of endured musically almost?
I think it's something people will kind of debate over, is this link, how much you can connect something that is non-musical to something that is musical, and to what extent that really gets conveyed through later pieces. Beethoven dying is the kind of the thing that people are responding to, and Beethoven's such a huge figure who looms over everyone who writes a symphony until the end of the long 19th century, but that's really what they're responding to, if anything. So it's like you could say they're responding to the French Revolution kind of through the kaleidoscope of Beethoven's music. But I think it's just there are other things going on, that music is kind of its own separate entity and yet still linked socially.
The question between how far you can draw a link between the musical and non-musical should have been like flashed up at the start of this podcast, like a big alert, really.
I kind of didn't want to shoot down the premise of the episode from the beginning, but I think at the end it's worth saying that like one of the most famous kind of histories of 19th century music is by this West German musicologist called Karl Dahlhaus. And he pretty much starts with this point that like you can't say it's about war and revolution and stuff. And then everyone, of course, goes on to do precisely that. People will write about this in all manner of different ways. And I should really have said as well that this is very much a canonical vision of music history. We're looking at a few composers who are the really significant ones. And I'm poking up every now and then, like Spontini's doing this and Mayhul has written the symphony. But you are going to get a particular view of music history as well by focusing on mostly instrumental music, mostly in the Austro-Germanic tradition at this time. So, yeah.
What you're really saying is like pretty much every single thing that this show produces, this episode is deeply and inherently flawed. But this time, it's not the hosts who are responsible for it. It's just the topic. Well, I suppose actually it is the hosts who are responsible for it because we select the topics.
I think it's like it would be strange if there wasn't any response to what's happening. I mean, war is something that does affect you on living through it, and so there. I'm kind of being facetious. There is obviously a connection with what's happening, but it is problematic to link them too concretely to one another, and you will get kind of shot down by musicologists for doing so.
I do also wonder if there's an element of perhaps ancien regime reaction. Is there also perhaps an element of people maybe wanting to consume music for other purposes than just memory. Bearing in mind that tastes sort of shift over time, and also you don't have sort of the notion of the film for a long time, and films being something that you can use to tap into historical events. So I wonder if all of those things are at play, but those are the pointless witterings of somebody who knows nothing about this topic. So I guess with all of that in mind, the big thing to sort of say is if folks want to dig into this more and therefore have their own argument about whether or not music is influenced by the events of the period, where do you recommend that they start?
I'm going to be really left field here and say Beethoven. No one saw coming. But really,
Not
like,
Wellington's Victory, though.
no, not that one. Well, you can listen to it and then, yeah, disagree with me if you like. But the big works from Beethoven to listen to first of all is this kind of this time are the Eroica, which is his third symphony, his fifth symphony, which has the most famous opening bars in music. So you will have heard that da 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 before, I'm certain. His Egmont Overture, which I have a suspicion some people and listeners will have heard the Epic History series on the Marshalls on YouTube, which every episode begins with a little bit of Egmont. So they will have heard that as well, probably. And the Emperor Concerto. So there's some kind of Beethoven big things to listen to at this time. Haydn's Mass in Time of War as well is interesting as a sort of kind of against war sort of piece in some ways. Like he was very, very deeply religious, and the kind of crowning of peace at the end in the Dona Nobis Pacem is kind of a message to maybe not fight so much. And then if people want to hear some of the kind of less commonly heard today pieces that I've mentioned, Mayhew's Symphony in G minor is a good example of that early French revolutionary musical style. The opera La Vestale by Spontini, which we mentioned and which Napoleon kind of pushed through and made sure happened, and Paisiello's Mass, written for the coronation.
Thank you, Christopher. For that, I think we've got enough to get our teeth into, or rather get our ears into. If you want to look at Christopher's book, it's by Christopher Kimbell, and it's entitled Wagner's Die Meistersinger of Nuremberg, not about Beethoven, but about Wagner. Thank you so much for your time, Christopher. I hope today's been a more seamless listening experience than what perhaps you're usually used to with Zack.
Rude, just
I'm
not inaccurate, but very rude. Although I will say, Josh, you have done a stellar job for your first time in the hot seat. Well, for anybody's time in the hot seat, that's been a pro's performance right there. And I won't dock your pay for the fact that you're being deeply peevish. Clearly, you've been influenced by Luke. Like Luke has clearly been giving you lessons on how to be rude to me. Or maybe not. Maybe in the staying with the musical theme and reverting as I often do to Taylor Swift. Maybe it's a case of it's me. Hi, I'm the problem. It's me.
We're going to end on Taylor Swift. Is that what we're doing?
It would seem so, folks. You have been listening to something not remotely Napoleonic within the last 30 seconds. But this has been music during the Napoleonic period. Thank you so much, Kit. Thank you, listeners, for listening. Thank you, Josh, for doing a stellar job with hosting. And we will be back very soon. Hello again, folks. Please remember to whack that subscribe button so that you don't miss out on the huge amount of content we're producing as we push out episodes 3 times a week. And if you're loving the show, why not leave a 5-star review? It helps bump us back up the algorithm and reconnect with our lost audience following the Spotify meltdown. Did you know that you can now join a mailing list to get regular updates on all the news about newly released episodes, meetups for patrons, new lines of merch that have dropped, and much more besides? To sign up, contact us at napwarspod@gmail.com and get your regular Napoleonic bulletin direct to your inbox. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on a daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you could spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in early October, are in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbel, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimbell, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon-Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, John Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findley, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, and Joe Ayres. The Admirals: Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, and the enigmatically, easy for me to say, named Zed, which isn't just me boosting the numbers before anybody comes at me. The Chiefs of Staff: Adam Coslin, the Marshalls, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well. And as always, thank you for listening.
Thank you.